The U.S. Navy's new drone refueling tanker, the MQ-25 Stingray, has officially begun flight testing, marking another big step toward the Navy's carrier fighters getting a big boost in range without having to look to more vulnerable traditional tanker aircraft. Now, this maiden flight was of a production representative prototype, which is a pretty important distinction for us to make because it means this concept has moved out of developmental testing and is now preparing for real-world operational service in just the next few years, where it will become the world's first fully operational drone platform ever to serve in a carrier air wing, delivering upwards of 15,000 pounds of fuel to Navy fighters more than 575 miles away, and dramatically increasing the combat radius of jets like the Super Hornet, the Growler, and the F-35C. But as genuinely invaluable as this carrier-based tanker could be for the US Navy, this 51-foot aircraft with a wingspan that's twice the size of an F-35A was actually designed to do a lot more than just ferry fuel. The MQ-25 was originally designed to serve as a stealthy long-range spy plane and strike platform. And that leads me to ask one pretty important question. Is this refueling mission just a clever cover to get the funding the Navy needs for what may well be one of the scariest and most capable combat drones ever produced? And to be honest with you, the evidence points to maybe. So let's talk about the US Navy's new MQ-25 Stingray, the immense value of its refueling capabilities, and the dirty tricks that it's hiding behind that tanker mission. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Ground News helps you stay on top of what's going on in the world while also helping you see right through common forms of media bias and the sensationalism that's so commonplace today. Ground News compiles stories from outlets all over the world and then puts them all into one easy-to-read feed that doesn't just keep me up to date on what's going on, but also shows me the different ways that media outlets will cover the same story. Like this one, about Israel's plan to stand up a fourth squadron of F-35Is and a second squadron of F-15IAs. Ground News has already gathered coverage of this story from 93 different news outlets, with 16 of them listed as being politically centered. And here on the right side of the screen, you can also see the bias distribution and factuality ratings for coverage of this story, with 45% of sources covering the story leaning right, and 72% of them rated for high factuality. And Ground News also shows you vital information about these outlets along with their headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, their corporate ownership, or their government affiliations. And I love the Ground News For You tab that keeps me up to date on the topics that I chose to stay on top of. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow that link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. Now, I've been covering the US Navy's Carrier-Based Aerial Refueling System, or CBARS program, since, well, before Boeing secured the contract all the way back in 2018. And right from the outset, it seemed pretty clear to me that Boeing had its sights set on much more than just the strategically vital tanker mission. Lockheed Martin's submission was of a stealthy flying wing design that, at the time, didn't exist yet, but based on the firm's successes with other platforms like the RQ-170 Sentinel, well, it offered plenty of potential. General Atomics submitted a tanker design based directly on what, in 2018, we commonly called the Predator C, but today we know better as the jet-powered MQ-20 Avenger. And then there was Boeing, who arrived at the party with a fully realized drone platform. Not a design on a sheet of paper, not a render of what could be, but a prototype aircraft that they said was ready to fly. In fact, it had been sitting in storage since its secret completion 4 years earlier in 2014, and before long was already conducting shipboard suitability and deck handling tests on an expensive stretch of runway at Lambert Field in St. Louis, painted with the outline of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. You see, Boeing's drone tanker entry was not purpose-built for the refueling mission. It was designed to compete for a now-defunct Navy program called U-Class, short for Unmanned Carrier-Launched Airborne Surveillance and Strike. Now, unlike the air-to-air refueling-focused CBARS program, U-Class was specifically focused on fielding an autonomous carrier-based unmanned combat aerial vehicle, or UCAV, that could serve in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance roles, as well as conduct airstrikes inside contested airspace. And right from the outset of the CBARS refueling effort, it was pretty clear that Boeing and, to be honest, maybe everybody else too, already saw the refueling mission as a stepping stone. A very important stepping stone, but a stepping stone nonetheless toward a much wider array of carrier-based operations that would follow in the not-too-distant future. In fact, I'm going to do something a bit out of the ordinary here, and I'm going to quote myself from an article I wrote all the way back in April of 2018. Quote, "It stands to reason that the success of a carrier-based drone refueler will likely lead to a push for more carrier-capable drones suited for tasks that extend beyond refueling. The next drones to deploy from American aircraft carriers after the MQ-25 takes to the skies will undoubtedly be expected to conduct other sorts of combat-necessary operations, like surveillance or even munitions delivery on targets inside enemy-controlled airspace, which just so happens to be what Boeing's prototype was designed for in the first place." Now, I want to be clear that I was absolutely not the only analyst who saw that writing on the wall. Legendary aviation journalist Tyler Rogoway, the editor of the Warzone that just passed its 10th year anniversary, go make sure to give them some love, was also on top of that program right from the start. And it was an article that Rogoway wrote back in 2025 that reignited my interest in what the MQ-25 might be capable of outside of that drone refueling role. In his piece, entitled MQ-25 Stingray's Extreme Range Gives It Massive Potential Far Beyond a Tanker, Rogoway took the Stingray's specs, including the fuel consumption rate of its Rolls-Royce AE 3007 turbofan engine, a credible estimate of its internal fuel capacity, and a few other metrics, to come up with an estimate for the MQ-25's still classified unrefueled range. And the figure he came up with was downright jaw-dropping. Based on the MQ-25's design, engine, and fuel capacity, it could potentially have an unrefueled range of nearly 6,000 miles, which he smartly rounds down to 5,500 miles to factor in the need for fuel reserves and terminal or landing operations that could include everything from descent, flying in a holding pattern while it waits its turn to land, landing, and then taxiing on the deck of the carrier. Now, you can think of that a bit like a fuel reserve in your car's gas tank that might be enough to get you to the next gas station. Sure, it is there, but generally speaking, it exists as a safety margin, not as something to rely on. Now that means this stealthy carrier-based drone may just have a combat radius of north of 2,750 miles. Now for context, the Navy's FA-18 Super Hornet has a combat radius of maybe around 640 miles, depending on loadout, and the longer-legged F-35C can fly out to maybe better than 690 miles. Now, these ranges are, of course, dependent on a bunch of variables, ranging from, again, payload to airspeed, but certainly this gives us an idea of just how long the Stingray's legs actually are. The ability to fly out to target areas literally thousands of miles from the launching carrier gives the MQ-25 some incredible potential mission sets beyond delivering fuel. But before we delve deeper into what the MQ-25 might be able to do, let's talk about how it handles its intended mission, because it's in that role that the MQ-25 can, well, honestly help to solve one of the Navy's biggest problems: the gap between the range of its carrier fighters and the reach of China's most advanced anti-ship weapon systems. Now, China's anti-access area denial strategy pivots largely on a variety of long-range anti-ship missiles designed specifically to keep American aircraft carriers at bay. Weapons like the hypersonic DF-ZF boost glide missile, which is carried aloft by China's medium-range DF-17 ballistic missile, have a claimed range of some 1,500 miles. In some sources, it's even more, and an alleged top speed of somewhere between Mach 5 and Mach 10. With the ability to carry large conventional or even nuclear payloads, combined with the sheer kinetic force of a hypersonic impact, weapons like the DF-ZF or even anti-ship aeroballistic missiles like China's YJ-20 can potentially have the power to render even America's Nimitz and Ford-class supercarriers inoperable with just a single strike. Now, remember, you don't have to sink a ship to take it out of the fight. You just have to compromise its ability to function. But before everybody takes those ranges as gospel, we need to take a short side quest to talk about long-range targeting, because it becomes a really important part of this carrier-fighter range discussion. Whenever I talk about extending the reach of a carrier fighter to outside the targeting envelope of these missiles, someone very astutely asks if that isn't a losing proposition right from the start. After all, we could spend billions stretching the range of these fighters only for China to turn around and just field an even longer-ranged anti-ship missile, right? And I won't deny that there is some truth to that line of thinking, but it doesn't quite hit the mark in this context, because in the nearly 64 million square miles of the Pacific, distance can become a form of survivability in itself. Targeting a moving object against the vast backdrop of the Pacific at that range, even a target as massive as an aircraft carrier, is no small undertaking. Even once China managed to locate the carrier, it would take even a hypersonic missile a pretty notable amount of time to cover that distance. At a sustained speed of Mach 5, covering 1,000 miles would take between 15 and 16 minutes, and even at Mach 10, it would take upwards of 8 minutes. Now, US Navy aircraft carriers might be huge, but they're anything but stationary. In order to launch fighters, carriers usually aim to have wind passing over their deck at between 25 and 35 knots. That's about 28 to 40 miles per hour. So even in peacetime, they are constantly adjusting course to sail into the wind. And when sailing in contested waterways, maneuver is treated as the vessel's first and primary means of defense, meaning the carrier is not only often sailing at speeds of upwards of 30 miles per hour, it is constantly adjusting its speed and its course to make it really difficult to predict its path through the open ocean. In the 8 to 16 minutes it would take for a hypersonic missile to traverse 1,000 miles, the carrier could be anywhere in a circle of between 4 and more than 9 miles away from where it was when the weapon launched. And that might not sound like much, but you should know that that equates to a search area of between 50 and more than 250 miles upon the weapon's arrival. And that is a big problem for both modern hypersonic weapons and ballistic missiles as they re-enter the atmosphere, both of which are traveling at speeds in excess of Mach 5. And at those speeds, the weapon's body compresses and superheats the air it interacts with, so much that the air actually ionizes into plasma. We commonly call that a plasma sheath around the weapon that substantially degrades or completely blocks all radio communications. This is why when spaceships re-enter the atmosphere, there's a communications blackout. In other words, while sending updated target coordinates to your hypersonic missile mid-flight is potentially possible using things like high-powered line-of-sight laser-based communications, it is anything but a sure thing. And as the distances grow, so too does the size of the area the carrier could be in when the weapon ultimately arrives. If the weapon needs to cover 1,500 miles at Mach 5, well, that would take between 23 and 24 minutes, creating a search area of more than 452 miles. If it needs to cover 2,000 miles, that search area becomes more than 754 miles, and so on. hypersonic glide vehicles like China's DF-ZF, as well as aeroballistic warheads like those in the YJ-20, are unpowered during their descent, meaning they only have kinetic energy, or speed, and potential energy, or altitude, to exchange for course corrections, which these weapons are already exchanging for range, or distance. So any shift in course comes at the direct expense of overall reach. Now, I should be clear that this is all a pretty major oversimplification of long-range targeting, but all in service to one really important point. Long-range targeting is just, well, really, really hard, and it only gets harder the further out you go. So, at least with the technology of our time, there is a real limit to how far out China could effectively target an aircraft carrier with a high degree of confidence. And broadly speaking, that tends to be a lot shorter than the distance crewed aircraft could fly, with sufficient fuel stores and tanker support. But nonetheless, these and similar weapons really do represent a legitimate and downright potent threat to American aircraft carriers, especially when you consider the cost-exchange ratio of launching a whole bunch of multi-million-dollar missiles to take down a multi-billion-dollar asset, like a carrier. Or, to put it bluntly, it's a lot easier to shake one inbound missile than it is to shake a dozen. So, the best way to defend against these kinds of threats is just not to sail into their targeting envelope in the first place, or at least to stay far enough away that targeting is very uncertain. But because of the range of those anti-ship weapons, that would mean the carrier's fighters of today could not fly combat sorties against Chinese targets without mid-flight refueling in what could well be contested airspace. They simply lack the range to get there from that far out, and today would have to rely solely on a relatively few, very pricey standoff weapons with sufficient range to make up the difference. So the Navy needs to find a way to boost the range of its carrier fighters, especially as it waits for FAXX to finally have its contract awarded for production to begin. And that is exactly where the MQ-25 Stingray comes in. While the MQ-25's maximum fuel capacity hasn't been disclosed, it's clearly pretty substantial, as this tanker drone is designed to fly out 575 miles, roughly 925 kilometers from its launching carrier, and then deliver as much as 16,000 pounds of fuel from its own internal tanks, using the same Cobham Air refueling stores pod currently employed by the Navy's FA-18 Super Hornets when they conduct buddy refueling operations. And I want to take a minute to credit Stefano D'Urso from The Aviationist for including the name of that system in his coverage, because I had genuinely always just called it a buddy refueling pod and never gave it much thought beyond that. But thanks to him, I got a whole new technical rabbit hole to fall into with my research. But I digress. That means this drone can fly that far out and then deliver more fuel than a Super Hornet can even carry to begin with, before flying all the way back on what's left in its tanks. In an operational sense, that could allow a single MQ-25 to completely refuel a pair of F-35Cs at that 575-mile mark. And that is a huge deal, because as I already mentioned, that F-35C currently offers a combat radius of roughly 690 miles, or around 1,110 kilometers, meaning it can fly that far out before it has to turn back to make it home without refueling. But if instead F-35s meet up with an MQ-25 Stingray 575 miles from the carrier to refuel, well, we're talking about extending the combat radius of the F-35 to, hypothetically, better than 977 miles. Heck, if it meets up with a tanker on the way out and again on the way back in, you could theoretically extend that reach to well over 1,250 miles. Now, this method of refueling means the MQ-25 could potentially fly even further out from the carrier than 575 miles and still be able to refuel a single fighter. But I do want to be clear that we're talking maximum disclosed ranges here, which, depending on how honest you feel the Pentagon is being about these numbers, might reflect the real limits of these platforms, meaning the safe operational ranges could well need to be a fair bit shorter to minimize risk. The closest thing I could give you to an official claim regarding the range increase the MQ-25 might provide came from Vice Admiral Mike Shoemaker all the way back in 2017, when he said, and I quote, The MQ-25 will give us the ability to extend the air wing out probably 300 or 400 miles beyond where we typically go. And believe it or not, deciphering that remark could actually be a bit tricky because of how common it is for nautical miles and statute miles to be used interchangeably in common conversation, despite being very different units of measurement. 1 nautical mile is roughly 1.15 statute or non-pirate miles, and the Navy usually tends to trade in nautical miles, even when they don't specify as such. That's why you'll sometimes see reports that the MQ-25 was built to conduct refueling at 500 miles, and others will say 575 miles, because 500 nautical miles equates to 575.39 statute non-pirate miles. Now, some outlets just quote Navy personnel and say miles without necessarily clarifying between the two. Reading the U.S. Naval Institute transcripts and then listening to the recording of Admiral Shoemaker's statement on their podcast didn't make it overtly clear whether he's using nautical or statute miles. He does reference nautical miles at another point in the podcast, and it's the only other time he references miles, so it isn't a crazy assumption. So then we'd be talking about extending the strike range of carrier fighter operations by, 345 to 460 miles? In the case of the F-35C's 690-mile combat radius, that would equate to, over 1,000 miles, and maybe even as far as 1,150. But regardless, with modern standoff weapons like the stealthy AGM-158B JASSM-ER that can fly 575 miles to a target, or even the in-development JASSM-XR with a range of over 1,000 miles, that is more than enough to keep American aircraft carriers out of reach of China's most advanced long-range anti-ship missiles, while still being able to launch at least limited combat sorties from the decks of these flat tops. And maybe most important of all, it can be done using a stealthy, carrier-based unmanned aircraft to refuel, rather than much larger and more vulnerable conventional tankers, which could then be freed up for other operations. Now that means reduced risk to air crews, but also the ability to more aggressively position tankers to support strike fighter operations, leaning both on the stealthy characteristics of the MQ-25 and the arguably higher risk threshold for uncrewed aircraft, even pretty pricey ones like the Stingray. But the utility of this drone in that tanker role doesn't end there. As I mentioned before, the Navy already has limited refueling capabilities aboard its carriers, which today comes solely in the form of FA-18 Super Hornets, carrying that same air refueling stores pod. But in the not-too-distant past, it could also be done by other carrier aircraft, like the S-3 Viking, which retired in 2016, and the KA-60 Intruder, which flew into the sunset for the last time, all the way back in 1997. And that's a bit of a problem for the Navy's Super Hornets. According to the Navy, this little-discussed airborne refueling mission actually makes up as much as 30% of all sorties that Super Hornets fly, meaning this mission accounts for a big portion of the wear and tear absorbed by the strike fighter fleet. In fact, according to then Chief of Naval Operations Admiral John Richardson back in 2016, fielding the MQ-25 will ultimately free up 5 or even 6 additional strike fighters for combat operations. Every FA-18 Super Hornet that is currently stuck being a buddy tanker could get back into the fight. In other words, fielding the MQ-25 will extend the reach of the Navy's fighters, extend the lifespan of the Super Hornet fleet, and increase the number of combat aircraft available in a carrier strike group. For the Navy, that's like a win-win-win. But as important as that carrier native refueling capability really is, we should also talk about other potential use cases for the MQ-25 once it reaches service. Now, this drone was, after all, originally designed for ISR and strike missions, with refueling just sort of tacked on after the fact. And while the design did see changes to better accommodate the refueling mission, we can still see that combat DNA when we take a closer look at the jet and of its marketing. The Stingray carries a retractable sensor turret that emerges from beneath its chin to support secondary intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. Now, we don't know for certain what sensors it specifically carries, but similar turrets usually carry electro-optical and infrared sensors, and sometimes even laser designators to identify targets to guide in laser-guided munitions. And all the way back in April of 2024, Boeing unveiled an armed variant of their MQ-25, sporting a pair of extremely capable anti-ship cruise missiles built by Lockheed Martin that we know as the AGM-158C LRASM, or long-range anti-ship missiles. Now, these AI-enabled cruise missiles effectively hunt in packs over ranges as long as 575 miles, using networked connectivity while they roam the ocean looking for enemy ships before distributing them amongst themselves and then using their electro-optical infrared sensors to find vulnerable impact points on the vessel that they close with. And while the MQ-25's maximum range is still classified, now would be a good time to get back to Tyler Rogoway's piece exploring its potential range and the future mission sets that range could allow for. As Rogoway points out, the MQ-25 is powered by a single Rolls-Royce AE 3007 turbofan engine known as the F-137 within the Air Force. Now, this is a variation on the same power plant found in the extreme duration RQ-4 Global Hawk, which has a whopping unrefueled range of a reported 14,200 miles and can remain airborne for upwards of 34 hours at a time. Now, the roughly 47.5-foot RQ-4 Global Hawk carries about 17,300 pounds of fuel and has a maximum takeoff weight of some 32,250 pounds. So, in the case of the 51-foot MQ-25, with a maximum takeoff weight of a reported 44,000 pounds, Rogoway estimates its fuel load to be slightly larger, at around 18,500 pounds. He then looked at the reported average fuel burn rate for the commercial variants of that same turbofan engine, which is 1,200 pounds of fuel burned per hour. So we take 18,500 pounds of fuel and we divide it by 1,200 pounds burned per hour, and we get a total endurance of about 15 and a half hours, which at a cruising speed of 375 miles per hour, well under the Stingray's max reported speed of about 525 miles per hour, well, that shakes out to an unrefueled range of more than 5,781 miles. But as I mentioned at the top, it makes sense to round that number down in cases like this to account for fuel reserves and the like, which brought Rogoway to a pretty reasonable conclusion that the Stingray might just offer a range of around 5,500 miles, which equates to a maximum combat radius, maybe in an ISR role, of as much as 2,750 miles, nearly 4 times longer than an F-35C. Of course, these figures are notional and come with a big grain of salt. In fact, I'm going to quote Tyler Rogoway directly about that. Quote, "Once again, these are all rough, speculative numbers, but what should be clear is that the MQ-25 is an adaptable, medium-altitude, long-endurance jet-powered drone, and this can be exploited dramatically by the Navy." Now, that much range and endurance, especially when combined with new podded systems and air-launched effects being fielded for both drones and crewed aircraft, well, that could have tons of utility for carrier strike groups. As Rogoway points out, the MQ-25 could stay relatively close to the carrier for extended periods of time, serving as a networking hub and even as an airborne sensor. The Navy's E-2D Hawkeye airborne warning and control aircraft has a maximum endurance of only around 7 hours, and it seems all but certain that the Stingray could exceed that by a pretty wide margin. Now, General Atomics actually intends to begin testing an airborne early warning and control version of their MQ-9B Sky Guardian this year, carrying Saab-produced air surveillance sensor pods. Now, similar podded systems could potentially allow MQ-25s to serve as a powerful addition to the Navy's Hawkeye fleet, plugging gaps and extending sensor reach as needed. Stingrays could employ standoff munitions like the JASSM-ER and the LRASM, and even potentially weapons like the 1,000-mile JASSM-XR if and when it reaches service. And to give you a sense of just how much combined range we'd be talking about at that point, that would mean a carrier sailing off the coast of Qatar in the Persian Gulf could still theoretically strike targets inside Beijing. Now, that's obviously never how you'd actually do it, but it does give you a sense of just how long the legs of this platform, especially when equipped with new standoff weapons, could ultimately be. Now, the Stingray could also serve as a drone mothership, deploying a variety of smaller drones or air-launched effects over target areas thousands of miles from the carrier. Or it could serve as a high-flying network hub to enable longer-ranged communications, including between crewed fighters and the collaborative combat aircraft, or drone wingmen, that are being fielded in the not-too-distant future. And to be honest, the list of other potential use cases for an aircraft carrier-based drone with that much range and some pretty low observable characteristics just goes on and on and on. And while I wouldn't go so far as to call the MQ-25 a stealth aircraft, it is certainly stealthy, making it much more survivable while conducting this wide variety of kinetic and non-kinetic combat operations. Stealth, it's important to understand, isn't something you have or don't have. There's no on-off switch for low observability. It's all about where you land on an observability spectrum, and there's always value in moving toward the stealthier side of that spectrum, even if you don't cross the notional barrier into what we consider to be a stealth aircraft. But as you might imagine, building the first large drone ever to operate within a carrier air wing isn't cheap, and building one that can not only fulfill the refueling mission we have for it, but has so much more potential for expansion in the future, well, that's arguably even a taller hill to climb, which just might explain the MQ-25's delayed entry into service, which was originally meant to be in 2024, but now has been pushed back to 2029. And the costs are rising too, with the per unit price now expected to reach maybe as high as $160 million and maybe even more. But if there's anything the US has learned the hard way over and over again, it's that leading the field is always expensive at first, and then costs come down as time passes and technology matures. Then maybe that's actually the most important thing to take away from the MQ-25 program and its massive potential. That all of this is really just the beginning. And when the MQ-25 starts refueling fighters from the flight decks of Uncle Sam's flat tops, it will also be paving the way for new drone capabilities and new drone platforms to follow, all leading to what will ultimately be a very different carrier air wing in the not-too-distant future. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com, or actually, just download the entirely free new Sandboxx News app that includes all of our written and video content in one free and easy place. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News. And if you happen to still be watching at this point, leave a comment about how crazy it is that I wore an Air Force t-shirt to record a video about the Navy.